Hey everyone, just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you left us a review and shared these episodes with a friend. We really appreciate your support in helping us to grow this podcast. And with that, let's get started with this week's episode. The relationship between the church and the state is one of the most hotly debated and misunderstood topics of our day. The phrase, the separation of church and state, is repeated time and time again by politicians, judges, and average citizens when discussing things like the public display of religion, particularly of Christianity. Today, we'll take a look at the origin of the phrase separation of church and state in modern American discourse. And we'll also see an example of perhaps the most unique gift a President of the United States has ever received. It involves a president, a pastor, and a whole lot of dairy. This is the story of church, state, and cheese. The President of the United States stood in the doorway of his home. It was New Year's Day, 1802, and Thomas Jefferson was ready to welcome his guests for the day. The first 10 months of his presidency were behind him, and he looked forward to the year ahead with much anticipation. As was customary in those days, a broad collection of visitors and well-wishers would soon be arriving at the White House to see the president. His guests would range from members of Congress to ordinary citizens of the young nation. The visit he was about to receive from the pastor from Massachusetts would be perhaps his most memorable that day. 3 days earlier, a horse-drawn cart had slowly made its way down Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying quite a unique gift for the President of the United States. Elder John Leland, a Baptist pastor from Cheshire, Massachusetts, and a small entourage now approached the President carrying their precious cargo. Leland had been a dear friend and ally to Jefferson for the past couple of decades. He had been especially influential and supportive in the 1770s and 1780s, while Leland lived in Virginia and Jefferson was drafting the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Enacted in Virginia in 1786, this law had guaranteed full religious freedom throughout the state of Virginia and ended the establishment of Anglican, or Episcopal, Church as the official state-supported church of Virginia. Elder John Leland had been instrumental in rallying support for Jefferson and this legislation among his fellow Baptists and other religious minorities across the state of Virginia at the time. Jefferson could not have asked for a stronger ally than John Leland. As Leland and his friends approached, Jefferson could see that what they carried was quite large, and they seemed to struggle a bit with its weight. As they drew nearer, Thomas Jefferson could not help but laugh at the spectacle before him. For what these men carried was an enormous wheel of cheese. Measuring 4 feet wide and approximately 1,200 pounds, the cheese made its way ever closer to the president as the men shuffled awkwardly toward the doorway with their heavy load. Jefferson could see that there appeared to be some sort of writing or inscription on the rind of the cheese. He nodded with knowing approval as he realized that the inscription was one of his favorite personal quotes. It read, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." He had uttered this phrase quite often during America's War for Independence. He and Benjamin Franklin had even proposed the phrase to be included as part of the reverse side of the National Seal in 1776, with the words surrounding a depiction of the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's armies. After the cheese had finally reached its destination, John Leland delivered a short speech to President Jefferson, expressing his joy at Jefferson being elected president a little over a year prior, and explaining that the women of Cheshire, Massachusetts, had worked diligently on making this cheese wheel for him as a gesture of love and gratitude they had for the president. One newspaper of the day even described the gift as, quote, a mark of the exalted esteem they had of him as a man of virtue, benevolence, and a real sincere friend to all Christian denominations. Jefferson responded to Leland with gratitude and complimented the work of the ladies of Cheshire as a, quote, mark of esteem from freeborn farmers. Naming it the Cheshire Mammoth Cheese, Jefferson then directed the cheese to be taken into the East Room, where it would remain on display for more than 2 years, until gradual consumption and the arrival of maggots eventually led to its removal. Leland and his fellow Baptists in Massachusetts, as well as throughout New England, were staunch supporters of President Jefferson, largely due to his stance on religious liberty. And this was not the first interaction that Jefferson had with Baptists of New England that New Year's Day. Earlier that morning, he had written a response to a group of Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut, which had sent him a letter a couple of months prior. After expressing their happiness at Jefferson's presidency, the Danbury Baptists stated their hope that his position on religious liberty would serve as a strong example for states like Connecticut to follow. At that time, although the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States prohibited Congress from establishing a national religion or denomination, or prohibiting individuals from freely practicing their religion, many states had no such prohibitions. In Connecticut, the state had established Congregationalism, the descendant denomination of Puritanism, as the official state religion. Although non-Congregationalist denominations like Baptists, Methodists, and others could freely practice their religion without fear of prosecution, state laws required that congregational churches be supported by state taxes. This caused groups like the Danbury Baptists to feel like second-class citizens by not being part of the state-supported Congregational church. The Danbury Baptists concluded their letter to Jefferson by expressing, "Sir, when we reflect on your past services and see a glow of philanthropy and goodwill shining forth in a course of more than 30 years, we have reason to believe that America's God has raised you up to fill the chair of state out of that goodwill which He bears to the millions which you preside over. May God strengthen you for the arduous task which Providence and the voice of the people have called you to sustain and support you in your administration against all the predetermined opposition of those who wish to rise to wealth and importance on the poverty and subjection of the people. And may the Lord preserve you safe from every evil and bring you at last to His heavenly kingdom through Jesus Christ, our glorious mediator." Jefferson's New Year's Day response to the Danbury Baptists' concerns included gratitude for their support and a reiteration of his belief in the principles of the First Amendment. He remarked, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." It was then that he included the line that would be commonly repeated or paraphrased in America's history, particularly over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. Jefferson continued, "Thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Jefferson thus wanted to reassure his Baptist supporters, as well as all other religious minorities, that the federal government would do nothing to establish a national church or violate their freedom of religion, and that he firmly hoped that the states would follow suit in that manner. 2 days later came the first Sunday of the new year, January 3rd, 1802. Like most Sundays of his presidency, Thomas Jefferson walked into the U.S. Capitol building and took his seat in the House chamber. He was not there to observe a meeting of the legislature, however. He was there for worship. This was not unusual for Jefferson. Since the federal government was moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. in 1800, church services had been held nearly every Sunday in the House of Representatives in the Capitol building. Regardless of the weather, Jefferson made a habit of attending every Sunday if possible, sometimes riding his horse through the rain and cold in the process. Taking his regular seat, Jefferson was particularly looking forward to this day's sermon. His friend and supporter, Elder John Leland, the bearer of the Cheshire Mammoth cheese, was scheduled to deliver the day's sermon. Leland was one of many ministers from a variety of Christian denominations that preached on a rotating basis at the U.S. Capitol. Not everyone was looking forward to the day's sermon, however. Manasseh Cutler, a Massachusetts congressman, Congregationalist preacher, and political rival of Jefferson's, scoffed at the notion of Leland preaching that day, referring to the Baptist Leland as, quote, the cheesemonger, a poor, ignorant, illiterate, clownish preacher. This brings to mind the reality that no matter the circumstances and no matter the speaker, there will always be critics, and haters are gonna hate. Regardless of the criticisms, Leland's sermon focused on Matthew 12:42, which in the King James Version says, "The queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. For she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, one greater than Solomon is here." Not much is known about the sermon beyond the text, except that he delivered it loudly, passionately, and with no shortage of facial expressions. Services like this would continue throughout Jefferson's presidency, and the practice of holding weekly Christian church services in the United States Capitol building would continue after the Cheshire Mammoth cheese was long gone, lasting until the late 1860s. To this day, the Cheshire Mammoth cheese remains one of the most unique gifts that a President of the United States has ever received. To offer one more bit of trivia about the cheese, some modern scholars have estimated that making the Cheshire Mammoth cheese would have required between 1,400 and 1,500 gallons of milk, produced in a single day by a total of about 900 cows. That's a lot of dairy. More importantly, though, much has been made in our modern day of the phrase, the separation of church and state. Regardless of people's level of constitutional knowledge or education on American government, people love to use this phrase. This is a phrase that, in its exact wording, does not exist anywhere in the United States Constitution, but, as we have seen, appeared in the letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists. Far from being a ruling document of the nation, this letter was meant to serve as a reassurance to the Baptists of Connecticut that the federal government would do nothing to harm their religious liberty. It further expressed hope that the Baptists would be treated fairly in the state of Connecticut, as well as all the other states in the Union. And that was it. Yet this line and the document has been used in landmark Supreme Court cases over the past century to justify our government's modern stance on the relationship between faith, government, and public spaces. All too often these days, government officials and private citizens of the United States have called upon the phrase separation of church and state in order to justify the removal of all things religious, particularly Christian, from government and from the public sphere. Public prayers, displays of the Ten Commandments, local displays of nativity scenes in the town square, and more have been done away with, all in the name of the separation of church and state. Well, this is what Jefferson would have wanted after all, right? Jefferson's actions in the story we examined in this episode indicate otherwise. Think with me for a moment. Could you imagine the reactions by many today if church services were held each Sunday in the United States House of Representatives? Furthermore, what if the President of the United States, his family, and members of his cabinet attended these weekly services of worship? Many politicians, judges, and private citizens would launch an outcry against such a practice, screaming that the separation of church and state had been violated. Accusations of Christian nationalism and attempts at theocracy would abound. They would perhaps point to Jefferson himself, stating that this was a violation of everything men like him stood for. But in doing so, they would be overlooking at best and ignoring at worst the reality that the champion for religious liberty and the separation of church and state regularly attended and supported these sorts of services in the U.S. Capitol. The modern interpretation of the separation of church and state in many ways misses the mark on the original intent of the phrase. Founders like Jefferson primarily sought to prevent the federal government from requiring the American people to worship a certain way or financially support a particular church. Public displays of faith and worship, even by politicians, was not included in this prohibition. In fact, by attending church at the Capitol weekly, Jefferson and other leaders of his day were encouraging, although not requiring, the American people to possess and practice faith in divine providence. Among other things, Jefferson and others knew that the best way for the American Republic to succeed was if the people possessed virtue. The promotion of free, voluntary, and unprescribed worship was the greatest way to promote such virtue in the United States. A virtuous people, they knew, would vote well, lead well, and carry on the protection of people's God-given natural rights. Many today fear to carry on this sort of promotion of godly virtue in our republic. They shrink from it with worry that it will offend people. Rather than promoting virtue, we increasingly see leaders embracing and promoting vice, licentiousness, and calling evil good and good evil. In the name of not offending, and under the false interpretation of the separation of church and state, moral relativism has come to replace the eternal truths and sacred principles which serve as the foundation of and the establishment of this nation. And so, for fear of being called a cheesemonger, if you will, scripture reading and prayer are no longer welcome in our public schools. The Ten Commandments, although depicted on the very architecture of our Supreme Court building, cannot appear in the town square. And biblical principles must not be overly advocated for by our leaders. This must end. The freedom of religion which we are blessed with in this nation does not mean the eradication of religion and faith from the public square. It does not mean that leaders cannot encourage or pass legislation based upon biblical principles. It does not mean that religious symbols or demonstrations cannot appear or take place in public areas or at public events. To say otherwise would be to deny the original intent of those who constructed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. Those who risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor for the establishment of this nation dreamed of a land that was both religiously free, yet not free of religion. They publicly acknowledged and encouraged the acknowledgement of the work of divine providence, while also not punishing those who refused to do so. Let us therefore worship, both privately and publicly, and encourage others to do so as well. At work, at school, from the universities to the halls of Congress, let us unashamedly celebrate our relationship with Christ, lovingly sharing it with others in the process. Let us vote for leaders who will unashamedly do this as well. This is not to say that we, as private citizens or public officials, should force our faith upon anyone. No one should ever be treated as second-class citizens because of their faith or their lack thereof. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects against this very thing. But we also must not cower at the cry of separation of church and state when we contemplate the principles which govern our nation. May we openly and publicly pursue the providential principles which undergird this nation. May God-given virtue be instilled in the people of this nation through the gospel. And may we, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, pursue as a people a correct understanding of a right relationship between church and state. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.